There's very little that is certain about life. Just imagine you get up in the morning, you shave, you dress in your smart clothes, suit, collar, tie. Then you go outside and you're grabbed, you're marched off, you're humiliated, abused, enhanced, or shot. Not what any of us would expect of life. But that is exactly what happened on the 22nd of April 1941 to 18 men who were shot, 17 men and 1 woman hanged at Pancevo in Serbia, just outside Belgrade, by the Wehrmacht in reprisal for the shooting of 2 German soldiers 2 nights earlier. It was one of many atrocities in the Balkans, and perhaps has been forgotten about. And yet, it was in many ways to epitomise what happened in the Balkans during the Second World War. It was the first of many brutal acts of reprisal taken out on innocent civilians. It was a random roundup of hostages and a random set of executions, a summary execution. It has been recorded on film, on colour film, which perhaps helps to make the whole event seem even more immediate to us today, accustomed as we are to images being immediate and in colour. As I said, it hasn't received the attention it has deserved. There are a couple of streets in Pancevo named after 2 of the victims, Vladimir Shestik and Jovan Maxim, who were marked out after the war by the communist state as worthy to be commemorated as heroes by the Yugoslav revolutionary labour movement. There are also 2 memorial plaques in the Orthodox cemetery in Pancevo in memory of all of the people murdered there. Otherwise, the condescension of history hangs over the event, the horrific event. Now, it all began in the confusion following the rapid collapse of Yugoslavia in April 1941. Following a coup involving the young King Peter II, who was to flee to Britain, against his uncle, the Regent Prince Paul, who was pro-Axis, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia and the country quickly collapsed. During the retreat of the Yugoslav forces from Pancevo on the 11th of April 1941, 9 Volksdeutsch or Danau Schwaben members of the paramilitary formation Deutschlandmannschaft were executed by the retreating Yugoslav forces. Their funeral was held at the Catholic Church in Pancevo on the morning of 22nd of April, with full honours from the Wehrmacht, whose military band played at the cemetery. Now, until this time, relations between Serbs and ethnic Germans had been fairly cordial in Pancevo, but were to break down during the events of the war. And the Yugoslav ethnic Germans were to be expelled at the end. Heinrich Köhler, a child at the time of the massacre, later stated that this mass execution in my hometown, Pancevo, ended a peaceful culture of coexistence between us Danube Swabians and the Serbs. Those events of April 1941 indeed changed everything. Jacob Awender, who had made Pancevo a centre for pro-Nazi ethnic Germans in the 1930s, urged retribution for the dead. The ceremonial funeral in the morning was to be followed by retaliatory executions in the afternoon. Now, this execution of ethnic Germans would have been considered provocation enough, but an attack on the German army was to ensure that retaliation and reprisals followed, as sure as day follows night. Following the killing of a German officer and the wounding of a soldier of the Großdeutschland regiment by snipers, perhaps retreating members of the Yugoslav army, or they might even have been shot during drunken revels amongst the German troops themselves. But the German army decided to carry out reprisals against the local population. Standard Commandant Oberstleutnant Fritz Bandelow issued a public order. There have been repeated attacks and snipings against German soldiers in violation of international law. For every wounded or killed German soldier, 10 Serbs will be hanged. If this still does not stop the sniping, we will double the number to 20. Bear in mind, these are all innocent civilians. So, 100 civilians were selected at random from the streets of Pancevo on Monday, the 21st of April, 1941. The Germans were later to claim that several of these civilians were armed and had sniped at German soldiers from a cemetery close to the main road, which they had reached by crawling through tunnels from a nearby restaurant and hiding in the catacombs. The homes of the detained civilians were searched. It was enough to convict them if bundles of civilian clothes in uniform were found in their apartments. The one woman amongst them, a cafe owner, Jarinka Siskulovica, was actually selling vegetables at the local market when she was picked up. But it was alleged that the snipers had reached the cemetery from her restaurant. One of the arrested, Marian Novak, was only 15. He'd been taken from his home, where a ceremonial sabre was hanging on the wall. This had belonged to his father, an army officer, who had died before the war. Simply by being in the house when it was searched and the weapon confiscated, he was convicted as an armed resistor. Now, not all of those arrested were even Serbs. Some of them were pro-German Croats, and one of them was from a Hungarian origin. 3 of the men were teachers at local schools. One was a civil servant. Another was a surveyor. Georgi Merzik had actually been working outside Pancevo as a surveyor and was apprehended on his return to the town. Another of the victims was Jewish. It was indeed a random selection. farmers, workers, merchants, businessmen, tailors, shopkeepers, restaurant owners, students. Some were young, some were middle-aged. Milutin Milosevic was not even from Pancevo, but was simply in town from a nearby village. Josef Weigel, a Volksdeutscher resident of Pancevo, later testified that he himself knew at least 25 people personally among the dead. They were harmless citizens who had done no harm to anyone. Now, you could say that some old scores were settled in the final selection of certain hostages, despite the overall random nature of the process. Students Alexander Topolovaki and Vladimir Zestik had been prominent in the March demonstrations against the Triple Pact and Prince Paul's Yugoslav alliance with the Axis powers. Pupils of the high school history teacher, Jovan Maxim, maliciously reported him to the head of the German police force. They claimed that he had actively criticised Hitler in his lessons. Well, he could apologise for them by saying they were probably unaware of what the consequences of their malicious betrayal would be. Another teacher, Mirko Skorpion, had been president of the Pancevo Sokol, the Falcons, a Serbian nationalist gymnastics club. Someone who obviously was there to be eliminated, not only by the pro-Nazi German population, but also an organisation which the Germans themselves would prescribe. These hostages were taken to the city magistrate courts and prison in the city hall. 40 of them were selected for trial, and they were then transferred to the nearby Hotel Esplanade, where a regular German military trial was held, presided over by SS Sturmbannführer Rudolf Hoffmann. 10 men were marched into the court at a time. They were given absolutely no opportunity to speak in their own defence. Any attempt by them to do so was immediately silenced. 4 men were found not guilty and were released after the intercession of prominent Swabian German residents of the town. But 36 were sentenced to death. 4 of the Serbs were immediately found guilty of the unauthorised possession of weapons and were taken out immediately to be summarily shot. The following morning, the remaining prisoners were led into the hall of the Hotel Esplanade and sentenced. The judge Bandelow refused to allow any of the accused to speak out against the charges and silenced anyone who tried to argue their innocence. He arbitrarily decreed to strike, to kugel, as he sentenced them. You hang, you take the bullet. Officially, death by shooting was for those men who openly wore their weapons. And the more grisly fate of hanging was reserved for those who had concealed their weapons, if indeed they had any. In reality, it was as random as the hostage taking. Now, after the war, the whole incident was investigated in Munich and Darmstadt, and Amazingly, in September 1973, Hoffman was found not guilty of a crime because from documents and witnesses, we came to the conclusion that the people killed on 22nd of April 1941 in Pancevo were partisans. Such partisans could be sentenced to death according to international law. They were killed after the surrender of the Yugoslav army on April the 17th, 1941. Looking at it, this decision seems to have been a travesty. There was no evidence that any of the civilians had been snipers, and no sufficient testimony from the witnesses as to the random nature of the arrests and the innocence of the accused. The men and one woman selected for execution were marched off to the old Serbian Orthodox cemetery, the supposed scene of the sniping. They were escorted by members of the Wehrmacht and accompanied by sightseers from Pancevo. Many of these sightseers, but not exclusively so, were ethnic Germans. Indeed, many of the mourners at that morning's funeral, still dressed in their best, came in a less respectful and a much more celebratory mood to enjoy the spectacle of revenge. The families of the accused, of the condemned, were forced to witness the deaths of their fathers, their sons, and brothers. For the people of Pancevo, the deaths were to be a lesson, a deterrence against any future resistance. 14 of the men were lined up against the cemetery wall and summarily shot by an execution squad of the Gross Deutschland Regiment. One of the 18 volunteer marksmen, Horst Hohenberg, later recalled that the victims were not banned and the two soldiers had to shoot each of the civilians. Any men still alive were finished off by a gunshot to the head. Their bleeding bodies were left sprawling by the cemetery wall for onlookers to gape at. Then, after the shootings came the even more horrific hangings, which were conducted like a public entertainment. The 17 men and one woman selected for hanging were to witness, in many cases, each other's hangings and see just what was to come very soon for themselves. Meanwhile, soldiers and ethnic German spectators made fun of them, jeered, and insulted them as rack swine. Even after death, the abuse was to continue. Horst Hohenberg testified that, in the afternoon of the same day, I took part in the hanging of several civilians as a spectator. I remember that sticks were laid from one tree to another. There were nooses attached to them. The delinquents had to stand on a barrel and the noose was put around their necks. The victims had their hands tied behind their backs. A Volksdeutscher civilian acted as their executioner, Hermann Brum. He had volunteered and he knocked over the barrel. Hohenberg particularly remembered an elderly woman wearing a headscarf. Hermann Brum, who carried out the hangings voluntarily, was a metal plate worker. He was paid 33 dinars for hanging 18 people, assisted by a Hungarian volunteer whose job was to tie up the victim's hands and feet, then hit them and pull the stool away to leave the body dangling. In many cases, he hid them in the crotch. A malicious act. The whole line of hanged men would then be jiggled up and down until the neck of the man being hanged was broken. And then finally the executioner pulled down on his legs to make sure that he was indeed dead. Drum, who was later to die in action fighting for Germany with the 7th SS Division Prince Eugen, took particular pleasure in his self-appointed task. He treated all of his victims with contempt. The Wehrmacht photographer Grunfeld later recalled that the hangings were carried out in an amateurish manner and led to unspeakable death for those convicted. I was very close to them. In their eyes, I saw a last request for mercy in the seconds before death. That didn't stop him from relentlessly taking photographs, and that made him complicit in the atrocity. He was uncomfortably close to both the hanged and the hangman. One death was particularly protracted. Among the hostages was a very well-built, very robust city official, Milenko Shevtik. He was looped 3 times. Because at first the rope was too long, and then it broke under his weight. Meanwhile, his children were forced to watch his agonies. Drum himself went off in search of a stronger rope to complete the botched job. The unfortunate man's build and the unpleasantness of his death made him a particular focus of attention. That was the same fate of the very tall, the especially short, or the particularly well-dressed. There was to be no dignity even after death for these Serb hostages, who were to be so brutally hanged. They were jokingly spun on their ropes with their clothing disarranged, torn and dirtied. The ties of some of the men were pulled out from the inside of their buttoned-up jackets. Their hair was mussed up, and their heads twisted and turned for comic effect. They were to be decorated with twigs stuck in their noses and ears. They were the subject of childish abuse and laughter. They were made to look ridiculous, and there was absolutely no respect shown to the dead. It was a gruesome carnival atmosphere. One well-dressed, debonair young man was singled out for particular indignity and ridicule. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, and one arm of his jacket slipped back to hang loosely behind him, held only in place by his tied hands. His tie was yanked out over his waistcoat. He was then crowned with a battered top hat that had been found abandoned in the cemetery, and his head and body were pulled around in all different ways to display him in ever more grotesque poses to give him a comic, somewhat clownish appearance. One terrified young boy was even made to pull his body into position with his tie for a photograph, and then to stand posing next to him. Soldiers were keen to be photographed next to the hanging corpses, and many personal photographs were taken. These were then copied for the soldiers of the unit who had missed the spectacle and wanted to see what it was like. Then the corpses were left hanging, still dressed in their now no longer smart suits, ties and hats, for several days as a deterrent before they were cut down and could be claimed for burial by their families. It was an unedifying spectacle. We all would like to think it couldn't happen to us, but, well, life, as I said at the beginning, is uncertain. Did any of these men know what fate was to befall them when they got up that fateful morning, the 21st of April, 1941? It's an unedifying thought. It is a brutal event, but it should be remembered, if only because in similar circumstances it could happen to any of us.